Chautauqua Institution's 10th annual Robert H. Jackson Lecture on the Supreme Court, and it is one of our most widely known lectures in legal, judicial, and academic circles. This lecture is presented in collaboration with the Robert H. Jackson Center, located in Jamestown. My responsibility and pleasure today is to introduce you to John Q. Barrett, the Elizabeth S. Lene Fellow at the Jackson Center. John will introduce our speaker this afternoon. John is a friend of many of you in this audience, and as you know, or may know, he is a graduate of Georgetown and the Harvard Law School, and he currently teaches constitutional law, criminal procedure, and legal history at St. John's University. He is the editor of That Man, an insider's portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Justice Jackson's previously unknown memoir of FDR and the New Deal. John is currently working on a biography of Justice Jackson, which will provide the first insider's account of his year away from the Supreme Court, serving as Chief American Prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to turn this podium over to my good friend, Chautauqua's good friend and partner, John Q. Barrett.
Good afternoon, friends. It's always a great pleasure to be back here. I'm pleased to welcome you to, as Jeff said, the 10th Chautauqua Institution Robert H. Jackson Lecture on the Supreme Court of the United States. What this lecture does, collaboration between Chautauqua and the Jackson Center, is brings to you a high pinnacle at the moment of the Chautauqua season, shortly after the end of the Supreme Court term, a leading analyst, commentator, expert on the work of the Supreme Court of the United States. Previous Jackson lecturers have included lawyers, scholars, and journalists to consider the Supreme Court at the level that, frankly, it and Chautauqua and you deserve. The lecture is named in memory of Justice Robert H. Jackson, who lived from 1892 until 1954. Jackson began his career in private practice. After 20 years, his activities as a Democrat and his friendship with Franklin Roosevelt led him to public service. And in his public years, he was 5 times appointed by President Roosevelt and confirmed by the United States Senate to high national government offices. General Counsel of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, Assistant Attorney General of the United States, Solicitor General of the United States, Attorney General of the United States, and then in 1941, Supreme Court Justice. He also, in addition to all of that domestic work, spent a year AWOL, 1945-1946, by appointment of President Truman as the Chief U.S. Prosecutor of the Axis war criminals in the European theater, the Nuremberg trial. Justice Jackson is generally regarded as the greatest writer ever to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, if you're a partisan of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., I'd like to see your evidence. If you're a partisan of Chief Justice John Roberts, or Justice Antonin Scalia, or Justice Elena Kagan, you may well have a powerful case, but you have a work in progress. Jackson was a model of smart, independent judging, well explained. He was a case-at-a-time judge, not a great ideological, pre-committed judge. And thus, his liberal friends believed he was too conservative, his conservative friends thought he was too liberal, New Dealers deplored his friendship with Herbert Hoover, and Republicans, etc., deplored his roots in the Roosevelt administration, which is a nice central place to be in life and in legacy. Jackson was a product, as you'll hear, of no fancy law school. And more than that, he was a product of no college at all. After birth in Spring Creek in Warren County, Pennsylvania, and a family move above the New York state line to Frewsburg, and modest public schooling there, and an additional year at the Jamestown High School, he largely apprenticed his path to the law, becoming a lawyer at age 21. His higher education was his lifelong learning, and a big part of it was Chautauqua Institution, a place he began attending as a Jamestown and Frewsburg boy, hearing William Jennings Bryan, for example, speak here when Jackson was just a teenager. Jackson began to be a Chautauqua speaker himself when he was a young adult, and that continued across his lifetime. He was also an inside advisor to the leadership of Chautauqua Institution, a regular attendee, a devoted student and fan and supporter of this place. Indeed, when Jackson died at the early age of 62 in 1954, his 8 surviving colleagues brought him home, and after the funeral in Jamestown and the burial in Frewsburg, they insisted on seeing the place that they had heard about so much from their colleague Robert Jackson. Now, it was October, sun dappled, turning leaves, deserted, but those 8 justices, the other 8 of Brown versus Board of Education, came here because Bob Jackson was Chautauqua and they needed to see what this was all about. Now, we continue that high standard, what Jackson was and what Jackson embodies in history, with the past speakers in this series and with today's speaker. Professor Akhil Amar, born in Michigan, raised in California, is really a product of Yale. He attended Yale University. He attended the Yale Law School. He strayed for a year to Boston to be a law clerk to then Judge Stephen Breyer of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. And then in 1985, he joined the Yale Law School faculty. Akhil is both a law professor and a political science professor, and his rank, his chair, is Sterling Professor at Yale, one of the most distinguished university-wide honors conferred not only there, but in academia, anywhere, anytime. He's a leading teacher, a leading scholar, and a leading public voice on the Constitution, its history, and its meaning. He's a great author. His books include The Constitution and Criminal Procedure, The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction, America's Constitution, a Biography, and America's Unwritten Constitution. And following this program, he will be available to sign books at the Hall of Missions. Akhil Amar is the latest piece in a braid that connects, a thick braid of connection, Robert H. Jackson, Yale University, and Chautauqua Institution. Let me spell out briefly what I mean. Well, first, Jackson in his life, and particularly in his public life, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, was a man of many close friendships and relationships with people at Yale, particularly the law school. This included the dean of the law school, Charles Clark, who later became a judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. It included a law professor, Thurman Arnold, a leading national author. His book, The Folklore of American Capitalism, was America's book in 1937 and 1938. And when Jackson was promoted from Assistant Attorney General to Solicitor General, he recruited his friend Thurman Arnold, the law professor, from Yale to Washington to become the Assistant Attorney General heading the Antitrust Division. Those of you who are lawyers and Washingtonians perhaps recognize the name Thurman Arnold because his career went from DOJ to the DC Circuit. Being a judge bored him out of his mind, and so he left the court after just a few years and was one of the co-founders of the great then and now national law firm Arnold, Fortas, and Porter, today Arnold and Porter. A second connection. Robert Jackson spoke at Yale all the time. One particularly notable occasion was in 1938 when the students of the Yale Law Journal invited Jackson to speak at their annual banquet. And he gave a very witty, eloquent, classically Jacksonian speech that in the end had a serious message for those liberals and conservatives, which was to embrace the issues of their time, to write about things that mattered, to debate until they were exhausted, and to, of course, do well with their lives, but to do good with their lives by pursuing public service. But a third part of the braid, a very direct one, wraps Chautauqua in too. Robert Jackson, man of no college education, had 2 children. And they, of course, were raised in different circumstances than he'd been raised. Jackson's son, William, after his graduation from St. Albans in 1937, became a Yale College student. Yale class of 1941. Bill Jackson ran the political union. He was the vice chairman of the Yale Daily News. He was skull and bones, etc. at Yale. A really big man on campus. But he was also a big man in Chautauqua. You see, in the summer of 1940, summer job, college student William E. Jackson, who later went on to run Milbank Tweed, one of the Earth's great major law firms, ran the Chautauquan Daily. He was a student journalist at Yale, and he brought here the Yale Daily News kind of engagement. And the summer of 1940 was a time when there were big things to engage on. It frankly included a little bit of Supreme Court and a little bit of domestic, but a lot of international. and it lit this place on fire. The Daily was a topic of great controversy, and I direct you to the archives and you can read issues and letters and so forth. But what you'll see is Bill Jackson embracing the Chautauqua ethic, that of course was his father's education and upbringing, and bringing to it the Yale ethic of learning and engagement and brilliance and debate, and plugging it into the challenges of that time. The debate, including literally between Bill Jackson and his roommate, Kingman Brewster, who headed the America First students, was about isolationism or international involvement. And Bill Jackson's editorial writing on a daily basis argued involvement here to an audience that wasn't entirely in agreement. That kind of scintillating journalism, study, debate on issues of the day was Bill Jackson, and was his father, and was in the Chautauqua institution, and is, I believe, the Robert H. Jackson Lecturer on the Supreme Court of the United States. And I know that it is Akhil Amar. I'm delighted to welcome him tonight.
This is our first time here. What a spectacular day. Thank you so much for having us here at the height of the season. We look forward to coming back. Today's talk is Robert Jackson and the judicialization of the judiciary. You've already heard a little bit of the background. Robert Jackson makes almost every scholar's shortlist of the greatest Supreme Court justices of all time. A remarkable achievement for a man who never served as Chief Justice, who died young, and who occupied the bench for only a dozen years. In several ways, Jackson foreshadowed our current court. He wrote with style and flair, better than any of his peers or precursors, with the possible exception of John Marshall. And in this respect, he set a high bar for all that followed. On today's court, Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, John Roberts, and Elena Kagan regularly use their pens to slash or soar or sing, and do so, I suspect, with Robert Jackson as their conscious model. Moving from style to substance, we should note that two of the most distinctive themes of the court's jurisprudence over the last half-century are, one, its strong interest in policing the separation of powers, and two, its special fondness for free speech rights. On both these topics, Robert Jackson got there first and set the model. In the separation of powers law, no opinion has been more influential than Jackson's celebrated concurrence in the 1952 Youngstown steel seizure case. I'll say some more about that later. And in free speech law, something similar could be said of Jackson's canonical opinion for the court in the 1983 compulsory flag salute case of West Virginia v. Barnett. And then there's geography. We gather today in Jackson's New York, the state which Jackson grew up, went to school, established his law practice, the home state of Franklin Roosevelt, who appointed Jackson to both the cabinet and the court, and the state where Jackson's remains now rest in peace, and in this very county, as a matter of fact, just heard. In his later years on the bench, Jackson was only one of only two members of the court who grew up in New York. Today, that number is 5. So here, too, Jackson presaged the modern court. Jackson can also be seen as the judicial sire and grandsire, so to speak, of the two men who, between them, have occupied the key position of Chief Justice for the last quarter century. William Rehnquist, who became Chief Justice in 1986, began his judicial career as one of Robert Jackson's law clerks. And when Rehnquist died in 2005, the job of Chief went to one of his own former law clerks, John Roberts, who, by the way, was born and spent his early school years here in Jackson's home base, upstate New York. So, in several respects, it could be said that we are now living, judicially speaking, in the age of Jackson. And yet, by other measures, the current court, by training and temperament, is miles away from Robert H. Jackson. Jackson, as you just heard, had no judicial experience before taking the bench. He had never been a judge. He had never been a judicial law clerk. He had not gone to a fancy law school specializing in training would-be judges. He did, however, bring to the court a wealth of high-level political experience, having served as FDR's Attorney General, among other things, as you just heard. By contrast, all but one of the members of the current Supreme Court were federal appellate court judges before they became justices. Many began their legal careers as law clerks. And every one of them attended an elite school specializing in training aspiring judges. None of them has ever served in the President's cabinet. None has ever been elected to the House or Senate or to any important city or state office. In short, we are witnessing an emerging new form of separation of powers, featuring a more pronounced separation of careers. The political career track and the judicial career track are being pulled apart, at least for would-be justices. Increasingly, those who aspire to sit where Jackson eventually sat, on the highest court in our land, must follow an entirely different path to power. A judge-centered legal education at a place such as Harvard or Yale or Columbia, 1 or 2 early judicial clerkships, a career of service as a lower court judge, and no ultra-high-level executive or legislative experience. The current Supreme Court replenishment process seems far closer to a bureaucratic civil service model than it was in Jackson's time. Whereas Jackson came to the court horizontally, from outside the judiciary and late in life, today's justices all moved up vertically within the judiciary, grabbing onto jobs lower down in the third branch, and in a much earlier stage in their careers, and then climbing up the judicial ladder. I call this emerging phenomenon the judicialization of the judiciary. Some background. Getting on track, law school and clerkships. Robert Jackson did not attend Harvard Law School or Yale Law School or Columbia Law School or anything of the sort. By modern standards, he had a remarkably short, distinctly humble form of legal education, as you just heard. After graduating from high school here in upstate New York in 1909, Jackson did not attend college. He spent only a year in an academic setting as a student at the Albany Law School in 1911-1912. He joined the bar the old-fashioned way via an extended apprenticeship with a 2-person law firm in his home district here on the South Shore of the Chautauqua Lake. Jackson's educational story was hardly unique among those who rose to meteoric constitutional heights in 19th and early 20th century America. Abraham Lincoln had no more than a year's formal education. Not higher education, mind you, but total official schooling, K through graduate school, in his entire life. Less than a year, his entire life. And never attended a day of college or law school. He, too, learned law the old-fashioned way, by reading law books such as Blackstone's commentaries on his own, by carefully observing proceedings in local courthouses, and by apprenticing himself to local lawyers who taught him the ropes. Now, flash forward to today's court. Every single justice went to college for a full 4 years, and then spent 3 years in law school. 2 studied at Oxford in between college and law school, and the third did the final year of college at the London School of Economics. Not only did every current justice go to college, every single one of them went to an extraordinarily selective and elite college. 3 chose Princeton, or perhaps I should say Princeton chose them. 2 graduated from Stanford, 1 went to Harvard, 1 was schooled at Cornell, 1 studied at Holy Cross, and 1 took his degree from Georgetown. Every one of the current justices started his or her formal legal training at either Harvard Law School or Yale Law School. What's more, 4 of the current justices have become full-time law professors at some point between Harvard, Yale, and the court, and each of the 4 taught at one or more of America's fanciest law schools. 1 current justice, Ginsburg, taught at Columbia, among other places. Another, Breyer, started and ended his professorial career at Harvard. Yet another, Scalia, taught at the University of Virginia and the University of Chicago. And not to be outdone, the most junior member of the court, Elena Kagan, taught at both the University of Chicago and Harvard over the course of her distinguished academic career, which included a highly successful stint as the dean of the Harvard Law School. To put it a different way, here are the schools that can with pride claim Elena Kagan as one of their own. Hunter College High School, one of New York City's most elite educational institutions, Princeton University, Oxford University, the University of Chicago Law School, and Harvard Law School. In short, we live in a different academic, legal, and judicial world from the one that produced Abraham Lincoln, Robert Jackson, and Hugo Black. And the longer version actually told you that Hugo Black was very similar to Jackson in all these respects. So what should we make of all this? Truth be told, I do worry a bit about the dominance of a few great law schools. Not because they're great, and not because they're schools. I'm not suggesting that mediocrity deserves proportional representation on the court. This is a lecture in honor of a man who is anything but mediocre. And it's plausible to think that all future justices should indeed have extensive and special academic training in law. Thus, this rationalistic, bureaucratic, Weberian civil service model may simply be the way things are or must be in a well-functioning, complex, modern legal system. But I do worry about a future world in which all the justices come from just 2 or 3 law schools. Don't get me wrong, I love Yale Law School, where I've taught for the last 3 decades. I greatly admire both the Harvard Law School and Columbia Law School, where I've repeatedly taught as a busy professor. So it would probably be good for me if all the would-be justices had to take my courses and learn constitutional law the way I think it should be taught. But would this be good for America? Or to be less personal, how good is any process of court replenishment that squeezes all aspirants through a narrow gate early in life? Even if we think that many, perhaps most future justices should have begun their legal studies at Harvard or Yale, must they all have studied at these 2 great schools? By the way, these are the 2 schools that John and I have. Isn't there something to be said for a broader and more diverse pattern of legal mentorship? What about someone who didn't get into these schools and then bloomed brilliantly later in her legal career? What about those college grads who dislike New Haven's weather and just don't love the Red Sox? Now for a quick word about judicial clerkships. Recall that Robert Jackson came to the Supreme Court having never served as a judicial clerk. Ditto for Hugo Black, and indeed for all the justices who sat on the court during Jackson's tenure. For the simple reason that the judicial clerkships did not exist on a broad scale until later in the 20th century. But nowadays, judicial clerkships are a pervasive feature of the American legal system. Every year, more than 1,000 recent law school graduates clerk for a federal judge, and countless more begin their careers as state court law clerks. For many of America's best law school graduates, the judicial clerkship is their first full-time legal job, and also the first rung on the ladder of hoped-for judicial ascension. From a clerkship to, for lucky few souls, a judgeship to, for a very few, still more years later, a coveted seat on the highest court in the land. On today's court, more than half the justices began their legal careers as judicial clerks. 3 clerked for the Supreme Court itself, and the youngest 2 members of the court did 2 clerkships apiece. Both of these court youngsters, John Roberts and Elaine Kagan, were born here in New York. Roberts did his first clerkship with a federal circuit judge in the state. Wales from upstate New York, in fact, and Kagan from Elmira, I believe. And Kagan did her second clerkship also with a justice from this state, and third at Marshall. Now let's recall Robert Jackson's role as one representative pivot point in this larger shift in the structure of the maturing American legal system. Though Jackson, when young, did not himself serve as a law clerk, a young lawyer named William Rehnquist did clerk for Jackson, and a young lawyer named John Roberts later clerked for Rehnquist. As an institution, the judicial clerkship has much to commend it. At its best, it involves a close personal and professional relationship between an accomplished senior lawyer and an average legal novice. The older lawyer receives help from and in turn provides guidance to the young assistant. It's a far more intense, personal, intellectual, non-exploitative, and sustained mentoring process than one finds at many of the big law firms and large government legal offices nowadays. It's somewhat akin to the apprenticeship system experienced by young Robert Jackson, but with this twist. It's an apprenticeship not within a private law firm, a law office, but within the judiciary itself. In other words, it's a judicialized apprenticeship with a particular significance for those who aspire to become judges and justices. In short, the now widespread institution of the judicial clerkship and its evident usefulness as a stepping stone to later judicial advancement are parts of a larger sociological process at work. The judicialization of the judiciary. Okay, now a few words on how you stay on track, lower court judgeships. Recall that Robert Jackson not only never served as a law clerk, he never served as a judge of any sort before winning a seat in the Supreme Court. He He did not climb a career ladder within the judiciary itself. In this, too, he was emblematic of his era. Jackson's colleague and sometimes rival, Hugo Black, likewise came to the Supreme Court with no judicial experience, save for an early and short stint as a judge on a local police court. You think Judge Judy or something like that. Indeed, apart from the rather forgettable former Senator Sherman Minton, who had sat on a federal appellate court for several years, none of the members of the court unanimously decided the iconic case of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Not Robert Jackson, not Hugo Black, not Earl Warren, not Felix Frankfurter, not William Douglas, had any experience as a federal judge prior to joining the court. Before Jackson's judicial grand clerk, John Roberts, became Chief Justice in late 2005, the court always had at least one member who had arrived without prior judicial experience. Of course, none of this means that various pre-Roberts chiefs were unqualified. Rather, their pre-court credentials derived from distinguished service outside the judiciary. More about that shortly. But before we ponder the credentials that early court members did bring, let's pause to reflect how different, how un-Jacksonian today's Supreme Court is. On the day that Sam Alito replaced Sandra Day O'Connor in early 2006, not only was every justice a former judge, but each and one of the 9 had been a 1 sitting, 2 federal, 3 circuit court judge at the time of his or her Supreme Court appointment. Never before in history had the court been so deeply judicialized. And then, in the part that I'm going to skip, but of course we're going to have Q&A, I talk about Justice Sotomayor and more recent experience, very much in keeping with, and Justice Kagan, in fact, that are in keeping with the larger trend. If you have questions about those two, happy to talk about them. Now, next section, senators and secretaries, by which I mean the secretaries of state, cabinet secretaries, need not apply. Now let's turn to the other side of the career equation, the non-judicial experience or lack thereof brought to the court by its members pre-Jackson and post-Jackson. Let's recall that although Jackson was never a judge before he was a justice, he was in fact a top cabinet officer. An attorney general would work intimately with and reported directly to the President of the United States. Among Jackson's colleagues, Hugo Black may not have been a sitting federal appellate judge when appointed to the court, but he was a sitting U.S. senator. 2 other members of the court, of the Brown Court, Sherman Minton and Harold Burton, had also come to the court from the Senate. Earl Warren had served as a 3-term governor of California and had in 1948 come within a whisker of being elected vice president of the United States. Remember the year when Dewey defeats Truman. Tom Clark, if Dewey defeated Truman, you see Warren would have been vice president of the United States. Tom Clark, another Brown Court justice, had, like Jackson, served as U.S. Attorney General, and William Douglas had headed up a major and politically salient federal agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Among Jackson's predecessors, even those who could claim prior federal judicial experience could also claim equal or even more impressive non-judicial experience. There is, of course, no bigger, in every sense of the word, example than William Howard Taft. He's always good for a fact check, yeah. Who had served as President of the United States and also as Federal Circuit Judge and SG much earlier, prior to joining the court as Chief Justice in 1921. By contrast, none of the current justices has ever served in the cabinet or been elected to any notable legislative or executive position, city, state, or federal. This is a wholly new phenomenon, yet another aspect of the judicialization of the judiciary. In 2006, Sandra Day O'Connor, who should be recalled, had come to the bench, having previously served as Arizona State Legislative Majority Leader. She was a leading Politico. Before she resigned in 2006, was replaced by Sam Alito. Before that happened, America always had at least one justice who brought to the court high-level elective or ultra-high-level appointed political experience. And then I give you some details about that. Okay, and I'm skipping some of this because I wrote more than I probably should have. Happy to take questions about the details here. Okay, so now at this point you're saying, okay, what explains all of this? What factors explain the apparent antipathy today to former politicians in the current Supreme Court replenishment process. Let's begin by noting the mushrooming size of the federal judiciary. Nowadays, there are more sitting federal judges than ever before for presidents to pick from. In the 1790s, there were 6 Supreme Court justices and only 15 lower federal court judges. Today, while the size of the Supreme Court has inched up to 9, the number of lower federal court judges has skyrocketed to nearly 1,000. Around 200 judges now sit on federal circuit courts. The main job of each of these judges is to write appellate opinions on a multi-member court, a job rather analogous to that of the Supreme Court Justice, in an increasingly specialized bureaucratic legal world. So it's not surprising that presidents might look first to this wide and deep first-level federal appellate bench when deciding whom to put on the second-level federal appellate bench, also known as the Supreme Court. Now factor in the dynamics of today's televised confirmation hearings. Long and highly publicized confirmation hearings did not exist in the era of Robert Jackson. Television back then was in its infancy, though the Army-McCarthy hearings were a sign of things to come. Today, an extended televised Supreme Court nomination hearing is the main event in the circus big top, with the crowd watching breathlessly to see if any of the acrobats, either the nominee being questioned or the senators during the questioning, will fall off the trapeze. In the gotcha game of Senate hearings, nominees are publicly quizzed on fine points of current Supreme Court doctrine, which is filled with elaborate jargon and intricate multi-part tests. In this game, sitting federal judges have an advantage over thoughtful lawyers in other parts of the government who may be less fluent in court speak. And let's not forget the value of vetting and the pre-confirmation confirmation. Every sitting federal judge has already been confirmed once by the Senate for a judiciary-related job, as has the SG, but not, for example, a typical governor or state judge. We just heard about how Robert Jackson was confirmed, but 4 times before his last and final Supreme Court confirmation, for a couple of positions lower down in the Justice Department, and then for the Solicitor General position, and then for the Attorney General position. So, while prior Senate confirmation doesn't guarantee an additional confirmation, just ask my teacher, Robert Bork, himself a former SG and former sitting federal circuit judge at the time of his unsuccessful nomination to the Supremes. Prior confirmation does mean that a sitting federal judge knows the confirmation drill and knows the drillers. Because most state judges, governors, and various other plausible Supreme Court candidates have never been confirmed by the Senate for any position, their nominations to the Supreme Court might introduce more wild cards into the confirmation game. By the way, and as I was walking up here, my friend Lori Miller actually gave me another reason, which I hadn't thought of before, I wish I had, for the advantage of lower federal court judges. It's the gift that keeps giving. It's a twofer. It's a double switch for the president, because if you pick a sitting federal appellate judge and put him or her on the Supreme Court, now you've got another vacancy to fill, another friend to make. That's not true even if you pick a state judge or a governor or senator. So thank you, Lori, for that excellent point, which she got in turn from a fellow named Lyndon Johnson, who knew a thing about the confirmation game. Sitting federal judges thus have an edge over, say, state judges and governors, and also have an edge over senators, who were regularly tapped to sit on the highest court for much of our nation's history. At the founding, senators were picked by state legislators rather by the voters directly. In olden days, the job description of the Senate and the court overlapped more. Both bodies attracted cosmopolitan lawyer-statesmen, and the Senate was famous for high constitutional debate, featuring the likes of Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun. Today, the Senate is a more populist body, attracting a different legislative persona. A telegenic politician, good at fundraising, glad-handing, advertising, credit-claiming, headline-grabbing, sound-biting, and democratic campaigning. I know there's some politicians and congresspeople in the audience. These are not criticisms, these are just political science descriptions of the different tracks, the increasingly separate political and judicial tracks. They're great at that, but they're rusty at the various techniques of close legal analysis necessary for sound judicial decision-making and exposition. Okay. Moving along. And in fact, I'm going to, even though now I've tried to describe it, I'm going to defend now, in the remainder of my talk, the idea of having some justices with more political experience in their background, in their resume. Why, you might ask, should we want any ex-senators or ex-cabinet officers or ex-governors or other sorts of ex-Pauls on our highest court? While I would not want the court overloaded with ex-Pauls, I would suggest, it would be good to have at least one or two justices who've experienced firsthand how Washington really works at the highest levels, who have seen up close and over many years how presidents actually think, how senators truly spend their days, how bills in fact move through Congress, and so on. In short, it would be sensible to have at least one or two justices whose resumes resemble those of John Marshall, Hugo Black, and Robert Jackson, to name just a few. One idea here is simple portfolio diversification. A multi-member court works best with justices who bring different perspectives to bear on difficult legal issues. Of course, we don't want diversity along every dimension. No stupid or lazy justices, please. But within the group of smart and serious lawyers, I've already suggested that we should not confine court membership to the graduates of Harvard and Yale. For similar reasons, I endorse geographic diversity. I'm not complaining, and he's not here, about 5 justices from New York. But seriously, 9 New Yorkers would be too much of a good thing. For similar reasons, our current court would be tempered and strengthened by the inclusion of at least a couple of justices whose career profiles were slightly less judicialized. Constitutional law, done right, requires the deployment of various tools and techniques of constitutional argumentation and analysis. No one technique works best across all the constitutional questions that have ever arisen and that will eventually arise. Some constitutional problems will be best solved with the tools of close textual analysis of a particular clause and holistic analysis of the Constitution's overall structure. On other topics, the original intent behind a particular provision may be especially significant and pregnant with wisdom. Still, other issues may be better approached through the prism of prior judicial case law. Sometimes, however, text, structure, original intent, and precedent may not cast much light on the legal issue at hand, and interpreters should instead focus on past institutional practices among the relevant non-judicial actors, settlements and agreements reached by differently situated political branches that have glossed an ambiguous constitutional text in ways worthy of judicial respect. Elsewhere, I've tried to write in detail about when each of these various interpretive tools is likely to be particularly fitting and useful. That's a plug for one of my books that's available after this lecture. Today, let me emphasize that ex-AGs, attorneys general, such as Robert Jackson, and ex-senators, such as Hugo Black, may enrich the court by brilliantly deploying tools and techniques of constitutional interpretation that lifelong judges may too quickly neglect or misuse. One virtue of appointing sitting federal appellate judges to the court is that such judicialized folk are already masters at applying Supreme Court doctrine, precedent. This is what circuit courts do on a daily basis. Study and apply what the Supreme Court has said about this or that legal issue. One problem is that sometimes the Supreme Court's precedent is dead wrong. Sometimes it's baloney. Not at all what the Constitution, rightly read, really means. But lower court judges who daily eat and slice this doctrinal baloney may be particularly ill-equipped to see the problem. They work in a bologna factory. Specifically, they may be inclined to think that judges are more right than they really are, and that other branches more wrong than is truly the case. Lower court judges may be particularly inept at analyzing Supreme constitutional text, history, and structure, because that is not what they do on a daily basis. They do doctrine. I sometimes say, they basically don't read the Constitution because, it would only confuse them. They don't have the time or training or inclination to seriously examine constitutional issues as a matter of first principles, historically and textually. If they read the Constitution seriously and carefully, as I said, it might only confuse them. At least it might, if the Supreme Court case law in a given area is out of sync with the Constitution's text and history. Recall that the job of a lower court judge is to follow the Supreme Court's precedents, whether right or wrong. So it's just not that useful for them to try to rethink the thing from the ground up. They're in a lower federal court. They're judges on inferior to the Supreme Court. But the job of the Supreme Court itself is, in certain situations, to correct its past mistakes, to overrule or depart from its erroneous precedents. Recall that Brown famously and gloriously did not follow Plessy's malodorous, separate but equal doctrine, the bologna. And someone who has not spent his entire life reading Supreme Court cases, who has instead spent quality time thinking directly about the Constitution itself, its text, its original intent, its overall structure and purposes, and who has also spent quality time in a non-judicial branch of government that is its own distinct perspectives and traditions, may be particularly good at knowing judicial bologna when he sees it. To test this hypothesis and to conclude, let's consider more carefully a couple of key decisions made by Robert Jackson and his Grand Clerk, John Roberts. In the larger piece, I also have a discussion of Hugo Black, but in the interest of having more time for Q&A, I'll omit that. But anyone wants to ask about Hugo Black, I'm always happy to talk about Justice Black. Okay, so what I'm now going to try to do, by way of conclusion, is to try to take one of Jackson's most significant contributions and one of Roberts, and use that as a way of suggesting the genuine value of non-judicial experience to the excellent execution of the Supreme Court function. Perhaps Jackson's greatest opinion, as I mentioned earlier, was a concurrence in the 1952 Youngstown steel seizure case. In that case, the court held that President Truman had acted illegally in seizing private steel mills in order to prevent an industrial strike that threatened to halt steel production at a time when steel was vitally needed for American troops on the battlefields of the Korean War. While Hugo Black purported to speak for the majority of the court, Black actually staked out a position that did not truly command the assent of the court center, represented by none other than Robert Jackson. It is Jackson's concurring. There are only two things that Jackson basically didn't like about Black's opinion. It's style and substance. It's Jackson's concurring opinion, and not Black's purported majority opinion that has, in fact, come to be viewed over time as canonical in the field of separation of powers. Black argued that in general, a president could not seize private property far from the theater of active war to settle a labor dispute unless Congress affirmatively granted the president authority to do so. On Black's view, the text of the Constitution was clear. The president has only executive and not legislative power, and the power to take private property in this situation, and in the situation at hand, fell exclusively to the legislature. The history of actual government practice in the years between 1789 and 1952 was largely irrelevant, said Black, who refused to credit the Truman administration's legal argument that various past presidents with apparent congressional acquiescence had, in certain situations, done things similar to what Truman was now doing. Quote from Black, "It is said that other presidents without congressional authority have taken possession of private business enterprises in order to settle labor disputes. But even if this be true," said Black, "Congress has not thereby lost its exclusive authority to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out the powers vested by the Constitution, quote, in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. These last words, of course, are drawn directly from the Constitution's text, a classic textual flourish that was Black's trademark. To create the impression of a unified court, Jackson purported to join Justice Black's opinion, but in fact Jackson sharply disagreed with both Black's interpretive method and Black's central substantive conclusion, as Jackson made clear in his own separate concurring opinion. On method, Jackson explicitly condemned, quote, the rigidity dictated by a doctrinaire textualism, unquote, an obvious slight at Black, at the opinion of Black that he was joining in theory. Relatedly, Jackson suggested that the history of actual presidential practice and congressional reaction between the founding and the Korean conflict, the history that Black dismissed out of hand, contained important insights about how best to construe the respective powers of the President and the Congress. On substance, Jackson argued that Black had gone too far. There was no need to say, as Black had said, that a president must always have an affirmative congressional statute on his side to do what Truman had done. It was enough to decide the case, he said, one case at a time. Jackson argued, it was enough to decide the case, Jackson argued, to note that a congressional statute had in effect prohibited the very thing that Truman had done. So maybe you don't need an affirmative statute, but you can't win when the statute says no. When Congress had already said no, Truman could not act in contravention of Congress. But if Congress had merely been silent, then maybe Truman might have prevailed under the logic of the situation, as seen through the prism of past institutional understandings that have been worked out over time between presidents and Congress. So you didn't need to go as far as Black did. You didn't need to decide the question, what happens when the laws are silent? It's enough to decide that case in Jackson, but here Congress has said no. Though I share Hugo Black's reverence for the constitutional text, you see, and at this point I always have to pull my copy out and leave it for you, as Hugo Black would have if he had been here. In fact, I've got some other copies here too. So I share, and here's the obligatory plug for another book that I wrote called America's Constitution. It's all about the text. Though I share Black's reverence for constitutional text, I confess that some issues simply cannot be resolved by textual analysis. The precise scope of presidential power is one of these issues, as I've explained in detail in my last book, the plug, America's Unwritten Constitution. The ultra-terse constitutional text of Article 2 must be supplemented by analysis of actual presidential practice, beginning with the practices of George Washington himself, and paying particular attention to situations in which Congress over the years has in fact endorsed various presidential measures, and thereby glossed an ambiguous text with institutional semblance among the very branches of government to whom and about whom the text speaks, albeit imprecisely. And this is exactly the sort of analysis that Jackson's Youngstown concurrence provided. Jackson did not shine in textual analysis in his opinion. Indeed, at one point he botched the key clause, the opening sentence of Article 2, vesting executive power in the president, and needlessly undercut his own conclusion. But Jackson's opinion did subtly explore and analyze the practices of prior presidents and Congresses, just the sort of thing one would expect and wish from an outstanding Attorney General, experienced in advising the President himself of the proper scope of presidential power, and just the sort of thing that might have exceeded the skill set and knowledge base of a lifetime lower court judicial functionary who had never sat in the room to advise a real president about high matters of law and statecraft. Jackson himself repeatedly called attention in his Youngstown concurrence to his own past professional life. His opening words reminded his audience that he had himself served, quote, as legal advisor to a president in a time of transition and anxiety, unquote, to put it mildly, just the beginning of World War II. An experience that he candidly confessed was probably a more realistic influence on his view of the case than anything else, including the court's prior case law. From his unique vantage point, judicial precedent was not the be-all and end-all that some blinkered, lifetime judicialized folk might imagine it to be. Quote, conventional materials of judicial decision seem unduly to accentuate doctrine and legal fiction. Unquote. Later passages echoed this opening theme with additional and obviously autobiographical references to executive advisors and presidential advisors. We should not miss the fact that Jackson and Black, whose biographies were in some ways quite similar, Black too had this sort of informal education, that Jackson and Black, whose biographies were in some cases, in some ways quite similar, we should not miss the fact that they did disagree in ways that their biographies might have predicted. Black, a former member of Congress, read the Constitution as giving Congress more exclusive authority and the President less concurrent authority than did Jackson, a former executive branch official and presidential lieutenant. But at the end of the day, both Jackson and Black agreed in result, and did so in a way that proved that neither was a mere politician. Both Democrat-appointed justices held that the Democrat president had gone too far. Indeed, Jackson took pains to stress that he was not bound as a justice to endorse all the things that he might previously have argued as the president's lawyer. Quote, a judge cannot accept self-serving press statements of the attorney for one of the interested parties, i.e. the president, as authority in answering a constitutional question, even if the advocate was himself. Unquote. Once a Paul, or a Paul's mouthpiece, but now a judge. Black robes and life tenure freed Jackson to act in a judicial fashion, even though he had not been entirely free to do so for some of his earlier assignments. In all these openly autobiographical musings by Jackson, we see that one of the most canonical decisions of all time was greatly and self-consciously enriched by the non-judicial experience that one of its notable members brought to the bench. It remains finally to bring these lessons up to date and to explain their relevance for the current Roberts Court. Because John promised you this is going to be relevant to today. So I told you how you get on the court today. This isn't just a lecture about then, it's about now. Let's recall that in some ways John Roberts is rather like his judicial grandsire, Robert Jackson, and in other ways quite different. Like Jackson, Robert served as Solicitor General, albeit very briefly, and technically only as acting Solicitor General in a situation where the former SG, Kenneth Starr, had recused himself. Like Jackson, Roberts brought to the court years of service as a lawyer within the executive branch. But unlike Jackson, Roberts never reached the highest rung of executive branch service. He was never an attorney general who regularly interacted with and personally advised the president himself. Now consider the biggest judicial decision of Roberts' career, which would be how quickly you forget. His decision to provide the decisive fifth vote to uphold Obamacare in the 2012 case of NFIB. Just think about how different your world would be if he had struck down Obamacare. Okay? So, consider the biggest judicial decision of John Roberts' career. His decision to provide the decisive fifth vote to uphold Obamacare in NFIB versus Sebelius. And I'm happy to talk about Citizens United. The truth is, that was, as campaign finance go, a joke of a law. So it wasn't going to make much difference either way. It had so many loopholes in it. So that's not big. Sebelius is what Joe Biden would call a big effing deal. That's what he called Obamacare when it passed, right? So, when it got sustained, I would think that's a big deal too. As I've explained in detail elsewhere, and long before the issue ever reached the Supreme Court, the Obamacare law, whether or not it's good policy, is easily and obviously constitutional if we're playing the constitutional interpretation game straight. But in our hyper-polarized political world, and elsewhere in this lecture, in parts that I wasn't able to give you, I talked about the roots of political polarization. Happy to talk about that in Q&A. In our hyper-polarized political world, alas, various interest groups and politicos ginned up newfangled constitutional attacks that frankly fooled some otherwise admirable justices appointed to the court by Republican presidents. But Roberts was not entirely fooled. Though he did say some weird and troubling things in his swing opinion to the court, he ultimately voted to uphold this law as a simple exercise of the sweeping congressional power to raise revenue. Obamacare is, among other things, a tax law, and the Constitution was emphatically adopted and later pointedly amended precisely to give Congress sweeping tax power. None of the other conservative justices credited this basic point, but John Roberts did. One reason that John Roberts may have been more able to see this basic point is that he had spent more time than any of the other conservatives in executive branch positions as to which the tax power was highly relevant. My friend Anthony Kennedy, the current justice who exudes the most confidence in the judiciary itself, in his voice and vote, never worked in the federal executive branch or in Congress for that matter. Before joining the court, my friend Clarence Thomas had executive branch experience only in matters far removed from the federal fisc. Both, my friend Sam Alito and Justice Antonin Scalia did have wider experience within the judicial branch, but neither of them had anything close to John Roberts' many years of experience operating at a moderately high level within the executive branch, dealing with a very broad range of complex federal laws, raising revenue and regulating the economy. Basically, what the federal government does is take your money. That's actually, what it does. And if you're a high-level person in the Solicitor General office for many years, you get it. I doubt that Robert Jackson would agree with everything that his grand clerk wrote, the defining opinion on John Roberts' still young career achievement. John Roberts did reach the right legal result in this key case. And he did so, I suspect, thanks in part to his own moderately high-level executive branch experience. And he did so even though the party that had put him on the court was none too pleased with this act of judicial integrity. Somewhere, Robert Jackson